Welcome to 032 Conversations, the podcast where we talk to creatives, see how they live, and how they do their work. I'm your host, Carlo Villarica. A few weeks ago, Henry Goth, shout out to Henry, thanks for inviting me to join the event, was the Cebu Literary Festival. If you don't know about the Cebu LitFest for short, it's everything literary. There's talks, stories, books, spoken word, theater, music, poetry, and a whole lot more. So the recent Cebu LitFest was held in Ayala Center, Cebu, and then there was a bunch of talks and a lot of really interesting sellers too. That was surprising to me. There must have been like 4 rows of tables and full of creators selling their stuff. Like a lot of illustrators, comics. Yeah, but this year the Cebu LitFest partnered with Comic Cat. I'm not really sure, but I think they're like a comic group in Manila. Anyway, but so there was like a lot of comics, a lot of stickers, a lot of drawings. In fact, I couldn't help myself. I got a few items as well, notably from Happy Garahe and Debbie Tudtud and Kat Laino. And then there was even a photographer like selling their photos for, pay what you want. I'm not even sure what this person's name is, but their Instagram is like Philip, probably Philip. They were right across. I guess Carlo Rodriguez was there, Lily La Primitive Art, and he was selling as well, and it was a really cool environment. So, so the one selling photographs, the pay what you want photographs is Phil Villarino. But anyway, so I bought a few things. I posted it on Instagram. I'll show you guys a link, and then. So that was the Cebu LitFest, and one of the portions in the Cebu LitFest was Ms. Henry wanted me to help somehow, and I told him, I've been doing this podcast, and maybe it'd be cool to interview somebody on stage. I mean, as I said it to him, I started to regret it because one of the things about the podcast, it's very intimate and private, and it just had that conversation feel. And the thing is, once you do the interview in front of a lot of people, in front of an audience, it automatically changes the dynamic of that interview. But all that said, I wanted to try it. So Henry recommended, what if we interview Lawrence Ypil? His friends know him as Larry. Lawrence Ypil or Larry Ypil. And I'll be honest, his name was familiar, but I was not familiar with his work. So I did a quick research, and Lawrence is very accomplished. He's an accomplished poet. Let me read his bio for a sec. So Lawrence Ypil is a poet and essayist from Cebu, Philippines. He is currently a lecturer at ALNUS College in Singapore. His first book of poems, The Highest Hiding Place, was given the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award in 2011. His work has received the Academy of American Poets Prize, the Philippines Free Press Awards, and the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, among others. So as a poet, Larry is super accomplished. But I have to be honest here, like poetry is totally out of my wheelhouse. In fact, I had not read poetry in the longest time. And my interview with Larry forced me to read a few pieces, and I was pleasantly surprised. I noticed a few things about how I read that I want to improve. Like my instinct when reading the poetry, when I first looked at it, was to go as fast as I could, and then midway through a poem, I realized that I wasn't digesting any of the words. I realized that I probably read way too fast. Like I tried to go through it as fast as I can. It's one of those productivity type things. And then when reading poetry, it's totally different. It's going through each and every word in a slow, calm manner and just trying to digest everything slowly. So it was a totally different experience, and I was happy for that. So so we did the interview live. Larry and we did it live in Ayala. There was an audience. So fortunately, we were able to record the audio. But bear with me, the audio is a bit noisy. We were in the middle of the mall. There's kids. There's shouting, etc. But the audio is good enough for you to be heard. And whatever Larry says was very valuable. There was so much insight into his words. Not just about poetry, but there was so much insight about the creative process, about writing, about creativity in general. And in the end of the interview, there was also a live Q&A portion. So we were able to record the questions and as well as Larry's answers. If this is your first time to listen to 032 Conversations, please subscribe to the podcast. All you have to do is download the podcast app to your phone and just click on subscribe. It's going to automatically download the podcast to your phone, so you won't have to stream it. You won't have to be online, and you can just listen to it anywhere, like when you're driving in a car or something. All right, let's get to Larry's interview.
And I didn't want to just meet him and not have any insight as to what it is like, right? So in fact, we had coffee a few weeks ago, and then I found out that he lives in Paradise Village, in this village in Banilad. And I did some research, and then he has some poetry out there called Paradise Sketches. And I found it really interesting because it was very specific. I also used to live in Paradise Village. And then there's one poem there where he talks about there's like a mass. Every Saturday evening there's a mass in Paradise Village. And he was talking about a specific person. And then I got a kick out of it because it was very specific in its subject. In fact, that whole bit of the whole Paradise Sketches was very specific. So I'd like the first question to be like, I think, as for me, when I think of poetry, I automatically go to the big picture, the big idea. But what was clear to me when reading that bit of poetry is that you were very specific as to the subjects of the poetry. So can you talk about like big idea in poetry versus specificity?
Great. Thanks, Carlo, for having me today. You're bringing me back to that poem which was written a number of years ago.
There was no date.
And it's for me really about a lot of my poems. I want to be sure are grounded in very specific things. Not all of it is autobiographical, So I think I like how you bring up that poem, Paradise Village Sketches, because in many ways it's based on real life. I do live there, but it's also transforming it. A lot of poetry, I feel, it's about looking at the specific details about your life, but not just documenting it, but also trying to transform it, and it depends, I guess, what form you're familiar with. Some people transform it into song, other people decide to paint it. But I've always been drawn to like you're saying, the specific and the ordinary. I feel like a lot of our conceptions about art is usually it has to be grand, it has to be huge, it has to be bigger than life. When in fact, for me, it's always been the opposite. What can I find in the little that I can write about? What can I find in the ordinary that may not have been written before? I guess that's what I'm drawn to that, and I get a kick out of it.
Because the reason I ask is that, like, in terms of my background in art, is like I used to play music, and whenever I try to write a song, for example, it was I was never very good at it because the problem was I had this big idea and I tried to put words into this big idea and then I really struggled with that. And then it took much later on for me to figure out that, oh, you can be specific with your art. You don't need to live this grand, giant life, although that helps. But it can be in the mundane, seemingly mundane parts where your art can really shine, right?
Yeah. And I think one of the maybe hesitations when you're, a beginning artist or a beginning writer, you might feel no one can relate to this. I think that's one of the questions. Not the one when you become too specific, kinsa may makarelate to it, and sometimes the thinking of the artist, if I become too specific, no one can relate to it, so that I'll just use, the big images again. But the weird thing about art, I think, that we sometimes don't realize is that if the artwork, the poem, the song forces us to look at the details of our lives, bitaw, as readers or as listeners, that also kind of invites us to do the same, and that's where the magic happens. For example, I'm thinking about common poetry images, buwan, moon, star.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
No, beach, and there's always the option when you're writing a poem. I will go back to those images. Kay murag they're tried and tested, right? I'll talk about the night sky, certainly. Diba? The moment I bring that in poem, na jud na siya. But sometimes it's, and we do that sometimes because sometimes we're afraid that the new image might be too different. Sometimes we rely on the tried and the tested, thinking that it will tell the world what we're trying to feel. When in fact, what we're trying to feel, if we really, stay with that feeling, demands a different image. I don't mean to be too technical, but I'm just reminded of a poem I wrote about Buyong.
Okay.
Yeah, because we used to go there during weekends, ba?
Yeah, automatically, as you said, Buyong, I thought right away about a beach trip. We used to spend a night over in our friend's house who had a beach house in Buyong. Automatically, that's the image that went to my head. But that poem that was called Buyong?
Yeah.
What about it?
So what you're saying, no? When you hear the word Buyong, there are certain images that already come to mind. And as an artist or a writer, you're do you go back to those images or do you try to do something new? So when I was working on that poem, one thing that I remembered about those beach trips were the food that we brought for lunch. I grew up loving spaghetti, so we always had spaghetti in the lunch kuan. And then the spaghetti was always placed in Tupperware. Unya, growing up, bitaw, I always remember distinctly once you open the Tupperware, there's marabitag water in underneath, almost I don't know the proper scientific term for it.
I'm going to guess condensation.
Condensation, there, yeah. So marag, those little droplets on the Tupperware. I mean, what do you do with that image? And I think those are the images which really, on one hand, stand out to me, but also on the other hand, as an artist, I'm intrigued by those images.
So it's very specific and then seemingly mundane, but at the same time, you're able to incorporate that into your art.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to think about the different ways to approach art, but there's another thing altogether to sit down and actually do it, to get the work done.
Yeah.
Do you have some sort of writing routine or?
I try to. I think the operative word here is that I keep trying to have a schedule. I think we always hear, if you're serious about something, and I think, a lot of your listeners will know this, especially with talks on creativity. There's real value in building a schedule. So for some writers or artists, it's going to the desk at the same time every day, at the same place every day, and really chugging it out. I remember being in Iowa and living with novelists. I lived with a couple. They were both novelists.
Yeah, for some context, like Iowa, you mentioned when we had coffee, was that Iowa is this area where there just happens to be so many writers.
Yeah, it's almost like a mecca for American writing. So they're the first place to have started the writing workshop model. It's called the Iowa Writers Workshop. And the whole idea of studying creative writing and earning a degree from creative writing actually started from there.
Oh, okay.
So our notions you get a degree for creative writing actually started in this very small place in the middle of the U.S. called Iowa. And it's since become almost like, a kind of pilgrimage site for a lot of American writers, because a lot of American fiction from the 20th century came from writers who either studied there or taught there or lived there. But anyway, I spent some years there. I was studying nonfiction, but I was really living with a nonfiction writer and fiction writers. But they were super disciplined. I remember Matt. Matt would wake up at 9 in the morning, have coffee, sit at the couch, read a novel. And that would usually take 1 hour, because by 10 a.m. he would go up at the attic. So we had a writer's attic in a very, in a very ideal kind of setup. And then he would start writing at 10 a.m. every weekday.
How he just keep going?
He just keep going, Carlo. And then kanabitang the dedication and the discipline was amazing to me. It worked for him wonderfully. I mean, he finished a book while we were there. But that kind of setup did not work for me, kaayo.
So I think you have a contrasting approach to how you do your writing.
Yeah. I think I like doing things in a panic mode. So I think maybe a lot of artists here can relate to how your creative juices come out when you're cramming.
Yes.
When the deadline is near, especially when you've passed the deadline, that's the time certain ideas stand out. And I think for better or worse, those conditions are exciting to me to work in.
Is that how the poetry in your award-winning book, The Highest Hiding Place, is that how... did you have a deadline for that book? Is that what pushed those poems out there?
The poems for that book took a long time. So they were written across a number of years. I did not have a book in mind when I was writing them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but at one point I sat down and said, I think it's time. It would be nice to have a book, no? So one thing I did was I looked over the poems that were written in the past 5-6 years and decided to, let's see what we can do to make a book. I think it's a different thing for different art projects. No?
Yeah, because I'm curious because, you mentioned like the deadlines was a big part of your writing. But who's giving you a deadline to write a piece of poetry?
I think for the book, the deadline was, I think I had turned 30 that year, Carlo. Yeah, and there's nothing like getting old to make you realize, what am I doing with my life? So I think when I reached that stage, I was like, I think it might be nice to have a book. So maybe the real deadline in that case was not like a physical deadline, but the deadline of time. The deadline of certain moments in our lives when we feel like, I need to commemorate this. Whether out of joy or out of desperation. But definitely that kind of energy was there. The deadline for individual poems, though, is very different. I think urgency might be the better term for it. Kanabitang you just feel you need to write it down.
So do you have stretches of like there's, I don't know, weeks, months that you just don't write anything because it just doesn't come, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, inspiration hits, and then you just keep going.
Yeah.
That's how it is for you. Because it's interesting because also when we had that coffee, you mentioned, and then I've never thought about poetry in this way. You mentioned that poetry is more like a sprint, and like writing a novel is more of a marathon. So I guess in that sense, even in your experience, when you wrote your poetry, it was all in that sense of urgency because some idea came to you, and then you just thought you were going to write it all out.
Yeah. And I wonder if like songwriters also feel the same way. I think it's one thing to write something regularly. It depends on the form. If you're working on a novel, obviously you can't run that long mile. You can't run on 300 pages in one breath. But there's the poem, because it is quite small, or if you can choose it to be small, it lends itself to a kind of frame of mind na you're hyper-focused. And I don't think you need to be a poet to get into that state. I think a lot of different art forms, or even when you're working on a project, I think with creativity, some people call it the flow. Like getting into the flow, diba? Murag, you're in that zone. And it's very hard to actually return to that zone once you are out of it. I think honestly, that's been my experience. So once I am in the zone, whether, there's a line that I like, or there's a certain sound in the words that I'm attracted to, I really try to find a way to drop everything and focus on it. Kaya it's very hard to go back to it. So once it's there, and it's different for different art forms. If you're a painter, it could be an image. Or, if you're an installation artist, it could be like the texture of cloth, and you just like get turned on by that little thing. And you're always faced with the decision, murag, do I stick with this, or do I do my other tasks for the day and come back to it at night? Obviously, some people are more flexible with their time than others. But I've always felt nga if you can manage to drop everything, then do it. That's why I think it's very hard to live with artists. Because it's a lot of unpredictability. But also a kind of instinct when I think this line will work. So I'm gonna skip all my meetings today and just see where this line can take me. And it can take you somewhere, it can bring you nowhere. But I think that's one of the joys of creating. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely correct. Like I feel like I've had situations where I'll try to write something, and then I have a little flow going, and then all of a sudden a beep on my phone comes, and then even just that little second that I look at my phone, and then it's gone, and then you're out of that flow. So that's really interesting. That's really it's interesting to me that it just happens.
Do you feel the same way when you're? Because I know you like music, Carlos. So for you, is that the same? Is that the same process? Do you sometimes
for me
feel the urge to just drop everything?
Yeah. Okay, so for me in music, I was never the chief songwriter. So I was not the one writing the music, but the flow portion of it in my end was when I was with my three friends, the four of us. We'd sit in a room and we'd just jam. We just play music. And there were sessions where you just keep going. And then everybody's connected to each other. And then the music changes. There's no verbal communication. It's all musical communication that's happening. So that was the type of flow that I really enjoy, and frankly, that I miss the most about being in a band.
But that's kind of like a group flow, no?
Yes.
And I wonder sometimes, I'm very envious of that, group flow. Maybe some other writers are just more adept at collaboration than I am. But there's something very solitary with writing, and sometimes that's a bad thing. But sometimes it's also necessary, especially, I'm just thinking of like the whole, murag uso manggod to collaborate right now. And I've been thinking about it that it's important, but I'm also wondering how you play with the tension between like
the
writing.
thing is, I feel like the writing portion of it, even in songwriting, there's a lot of songwriters who just the writing portion, the actual writing of the song, because like what we were doing with the band is, we're meshing as a band, and then really good musicians can do this on stage. We're not really good musicians. We were doing it in the privacy of this locked room, but really good musicians are able to do that and stick to the flow, and it'll come out really beautiful music, right? But there's a difference when you have to write down words. I feel like the act of writing down words is in fact it's much more suited as a solitary pursuit, no? But anyway, let's move on, right? One of, I'll be honest, the first time I read poetry was when I heard that I might be interviewing you, right? I mentioned earlier. And then, so I tried to read poetry, and then it occurred to me that my default when I read in general is just to go as fast as I can. Just try to get as much information as I can. So like, let's say you read like a book or a blog post, right? You just try to learn or just try to get the story as fast as I can. And then it occurred to me when I tried to read poetry, that's probably not a good way to read. So like I was reading some of your work, and then my initial instinct is to just go, just go, and just go line after line after line. And then midway through, I was like, wait, I'm not getting anything. And then it occurred to me that I have to read really slowly to absorb the poetry. I don't know. Is there something there? Is this just me, or is there really like a way to read poetry as opposed to like different ways of writing?
Yeah, I think with poetry, much of it is, I like to call it reading with your ear.
Sorry?
Reading with your ear.
Okay.
Or maybe, like reading with your mouth, but really reading with your ear. When we're usually like reading the paper or reading something online, it's content and information we're after, So you want things clear, you want things quick. But with poetry, that's for me like one of its fundamental experience. The fundamental experience of reading poetry is its slowness. I like how you're describing it. What comes to mind for me is the idea of drag. You know how when something gets dragged, when you're like lifting this bench, and then, there's friction, and then you can't really do things fast. And you're like, how can I make it fast? But there's, on the other hand, it's like, why is it necessary that there has to be this kind of drag or friction? And I think that's where poetry becomes really interesting, because like when you're cutting the line with poetry, and I think that's what you might be pointing at. The line to me is very important. We have the whole question, why does the poem have to be cut up in lines? Why can't it just be like one long paragraph? And for me, I think of what one of my teachers told me. Her name is Benilda Santos. She teaches in Ateneo. And she always said, and someone asked her, she writes very short poems, very thin lines. And she tells the story, a student asked, why are your poems so short? Why are the lines cut up like this? And her answer was, it's because I was asthmatic when I was a kid.
That's what she said?
That's what she said, which is a great answer, diba? She said, I can't really breathe deeply. And that really made me think, when we're reading poetry, we're not just reading the meaning that the writer wants to convey to us. We're reading for the writer's breath. So when, for example, Walt Whitman insists on the long poetic line and leaves us out of breath, there's a reason for that, you know. Or when someone like Benilda Santos or like Emily Dickinson or William Carlos Williams, they choose very short lines. It's like they're asking us to breathe every time the line stops. And I think that's so important to reading poetry because you're experiencing language with your body. So I don't know if that sounds too esoteric na, no? But you know, we think of language as meaning ramang good, when in fact, you know, language is with our body. We speak with it. Each of us has a different tone when we're speaking. You know, some prefer a long line. Some people can just keep yapping on forever, where others rarely talk. And that's part of the individuality of our experience with language. And I think poetry allows us, Magud, to explore that individuality. Like, you talk different than I, and I think part of our voice, you know, a lot of artists are finding their voice. Sometimes I think the answer is pretty simple. You know, each of us has very distinct literal voices. And sometimes all it takes is that we're sensitive a bit to the way we talk. And then we kind of play around with that notion. Yeah.
Yeah, because you know, as you were talking, it reminded me that you know, you sent me a few MP3s of you reading your poetry, and then as I was listening to it, my instinct was, I wonder what this looks like on paper. No, because I can't recall now exactly which one, but there was one that it reminded me a lot like listening to a podcast and then there's like a story element in it. And then in fact, if you didn't tell me it was poetry, that wouldn't have been my instinct. I wouldn't have thought that, oh, okay, it sounded a lot like somebody telling a story, right? Yeah, and I hope that's what you were going for.
But I think that's touching on an important aspect, especially with the popularity of performance poetry.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Yeah. No. So there are poets that really identify themselves as performance poets, and there are poets that identify themselves as what they call page poet. You know, I'm a poet of the page, and poetry is a mix of both. So there are artists that, you know, are amazing performers, and when you're watching them live and hearing them live, it's great, but when it's on the page, it's horrible. Whereas the other way around, you know, there are poems when you read it on the page and you your eyes just like linger around the page. That's where the magic happens. And then the moment you hear them like perform it, they're the most horrible readers of their own poetry. So kanabitang, it's part of, I think it's exciting because you get to, it's part of the medium. And, you know, I wonder too whether the same thing could be said of podcasts in your experience, where there are really good stories that lambing kayo when you're hearing them. But yeah, are very different when you're, you know, in your room alone and you're reading the book.
Yeah. Have you ever tried performing your poetry on stage?
I've read some poems on stage before, yes. But I would not call myself a performer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the really legit performers are, you know, they're really performing. Although some people have said na once they hear me read a poem, they say nga that they understand my poem better. So like, they didn't really understand it on the page, but they said nga once we heard your work, it seems like we understand it better. So I don't know if that's like a veiled way of saying your poems need work. You know?
So we're talking a lot about writing in general, poetry, writing, and then that got me thinking. It takes a certain type of person to want to write in the first place, right? And in considering what you have gotten out of it, in fact, I think you were a recent finalist in this Gaudy, what is it called?
Yeah, it's the Gaudy Boy Poetry Prize.
Yeah, Gaudy Boy Poetry finalist. Wait, actually, how do those things work? Do you submit your work to these publications or these? Are they contests?
Yeah, most of them are contests. I think with the poetry world, because poetry doesn't sell as big as the novels. You know, so if you're a novelist, usually it's like you look for an agent. And I'm talking about the international stage, huh?
Yeah.
You know, if you have a novel to sell, the first step is usually not to go directly to the publisher. The first step is to find an agent, and then that agent will be the one to kind of like represent you to the publishers. With poets, unfortunately or fortunately, there's not a huge market. It's very niche. There are lovers of poetry, and they're willing to buy it. You know, poetry is an interesting market because I think we also don't. There are times in our life when we need poetry. There's also times when we don't need poetry. So it's a very interesting art form. So like poetry is usually most popular when you're young, you're adolescent. It's first heartbreak, gibuwagan ka. You run to poetry. And then they notice nga, 20s, 30s, you lead a stable life, maybe you find happiness, you stop reading poetry. And then they notice nga, when you're older and you're more sentimental, then you return to poetry. So poetry has this, it's not like poetry doesn't have a market. I think poetry has an interesting market because it targets certain people, but it also targets a lot of people at different parts of their lives. But sorry, let me get back to your question. Because there's no market really, there's no mainstream market for poetry. A lot of it is contests, so I guess it's useful for those of you who are writing poetry. A lot of the books in the international arena are usually, you usually get a book done once you win a prize. So thankfully, the internet has made things a bit more accessible. Unfortunately, a lot of these book prizes usually have an admission fee. So when you submit, you have to pay like a fee. So you usually submit to these contests, and yeah, it's either they pick your book up, your book wins, and part of the prize is getting published into the book.
How do you find these contests? Like for somebody who's first getting into poetry, getting into writing, and they just don't know where to go. How do they know where to submit their work, especially considering that there's an upfront fee? So like if you don't know anything in the beginning, how do you know this contest is legit? They're not going to screw you over. So how does is there? I don't know. How did you find out where to submit poetry?
Yeah, much of I think decisions are best done when you know who the judge is, the final judge. So maybe my tip is that when you're joining a contest, make sure you're joining a contest where the results or decisions actually matter. It might be the final judge might be a poet that you already love. So legitimacy comes into that. Now, as to the question of how do you know where to submit? One thing you can do is look into the websites or the books of the writers that you like. And usually they will list publications that their poems have come out in. And that's always a good place to start because, if your idol, a particular poet, her poems come out in certain literary journals, you might want to try sending your poems out to those journals. I think that's important to think about, especially with the internet. There's actually a lot of literary journals. So it's not a question of there's no avenue to submit. Sometimes the challenge is figuring out where do you send it. And I think,
Which is a good segue to CHA, which is an Asian literary journal, which there recently, I think it was this month, right, that came out with a Philippine episode. Philippine journal. So can you talk about that? Because I believe that you were one of the Is editor the right term?
I co-edited this one. So Cha is an online journal that comes out of Hong Kong, and every few of their issues per year is dedicated to a special issue on a country. So for July, their special issue was focused on the Philippines. So I had such great pleasure editing that issue together with Ricky de Ungria, who is another Filipino poet who is based in Mindanao. So what usually happens in that case, as co-editors, Ricky and I, talked a bit, submitted our votes regarding the submissions, and it was the final decisions were eventually the consensus between us, the guest editors, and editors Jeff and Tammy from Cha. So yeah, that was a really good experience.
Yeah, I know. I think they're here now. Happy Garaje is one of the shout out to Happy Garaje. They're here somewhere.
Hi, Mark and Joe.
Hi, guys. Anyway, they're there. So so they were also part of the that chat journal for July.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned a lot of the writers. It really showed the Philippines in a sense where we are a country that has a lot of people in other nations as well.
Yeah. A good number of the submissions were coming from places we don't traditionally look for. I think with Philippine literature, there's a long tradition of work coming from the centers, and usually that's Manila, and I might even consider Cebu as a kind of the cultural center. And more often than not, the poems that we read, the poets that we come across are poets who come from these centers. I think the great thing about the online platform is that the reach is wider, and Filipinos who work abroad or Filipinos who live and come from parts of the Philippines that we don't usually hear from are able to submit work, and that was, for me, that was the greatest thing about editing that issue. It was coming across writers, and it was done blindly. So I was just reading the poems, and we were,
there were no names.
There were no
involved.
names, so it was great. No, it was also I felt nervous for the writers, and when eventually we found out, it was the issue came out. A lot of them were names I had never read before, and a good number of them are also from Cebu, and from Mindanao. So these are voices we don't usually hear from, and it was really good to just realize that there were writers you had not heard before, and that's really a good sign for an industry, that there are new names out there.
Which is interesting because we've skirted around it a little bit, but this begs the question why write? It's even if it's not poetry, it's such a difficult profession in a way where the amount of effort put in, there's a huge amount of effort put into writing, and then the return is sometimes, at least monetarily, it does not I don't know what the word is, but it doesn't match the effort, no? But
it doesn't do justice.
Yes. So why do you think people want to write? Why do you write? What's your motivation to do so?
I mean, for me, there are things that are difficult to talk about. There are things you hesitate to verbalize, to talk about with your friends, your family, even if you're very close to them. There are certain things you don't say. No matter how intimate your relationship, there are things you would never tell your husband, your wife, your lover. And for me, that's what the page has always offered. The page is where you can begin to say the things that you would never say in real life. So there's a certain kind of necessity to it. Because I feel like if you can say it, why not just say it? But there will always be things you can't say, Manggod. And that's where the page Morabitag offers a space for you to put down your thoughts that you otherwise would not say. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense to me because, frankly, there were some of the poems that I read from you. It got me uncomfortable as I read it. Do you get what I'm saying? Like I'm not sure I could share this specific story with another person in that sense, unless it was written down and then the details were almost taken away. I don't want to get into the specifics.
But yeah, there are definitely things in those poems I might feel awkward to tell you right now. But I definitely did not feel awkward to put down. And I think that's the wonderful thing about, I think, writing and reading. Especially reading, it's reading probably is one of the last remaining pleasurably solitary activities. Now you're just there and the writer, and you're like, it's like you're super close to the writer. It's like, why is this guy telling me all of this? And it brings us to a space of honesty and vulnerability. And awkwardness. I love how you bring that up because like the works that I remember reading and loving growing up are not works that left me comfortable and cheerful. They're works that left me bothered and shaken, and I didn't quite understand what I was going through, but there was something in the work that spoke to me that no one else that I had met spoke to me, and I had a connection to a writer that I might never meet in my life, but in the moment of reading, it felt like I was understood and I understood them, and it was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was great because it was honest.
Does any specific writer come to mind?
I mean, when I first read Sylvia Plath and her intensity, she's an American poet, usually considered a feminist poet, and a lot of her poems were quite angry. And her work was important, especially for, the feminism in the sense of allowing, sensibility to own up to their feelings. And kanabitang isog. Isog yung poems. Angry yung poems. Wow. Force ni siya. This writer is a force to reckon with. And, yeah. She was one of them.
I wonder if she was in real life, like this really,
Well, she led quite a tragic life, She ended up committing, unfortunately, suicide at some point. And that's part of the reason why her work is popular, but that's also part of the reason why her work is powerful.
And speaking of work, so are you working on anything right now?
Right now, I've been working on poems that are talking about photographs. I've been writing about early 20th century photographs of Cebu. So these are photographs from the University of San Carlos archives. And I've been writing poems about them. I'm also releasing, just for this LitFest, I'm releasing a small chapbook of poems. It's called Night Report. These were uncollected poems that I decided to collect and release today. So those are some of the things that, I guess I've been working.
When's the poetry on the photographs? Do they have a name yet? Nothing.
It's tentatively called There. So that's actually the manuscript that became a finalist for that prize.
Okay.
So we'll see how that goes. But definitely, getting that finalist was a good signal to me as a writer. Na, there's something in this manuscript. So, it helps to, build confidence and makes me want to return to the work and work on it.
And then eventually it's going to become a book?
That is my hope.
Okay, so there's no date yet?
There is no date yet. And I will let you guys know if there is a date.
I'd like to open it up to.
Sure. Yeah.
Unless you wanna, did we miss anything? Is there something you
No.
want to talk about?
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody want to ask a question to Mr. Larry Ypil? Anybody?
Hi, Larry. He actually invited me over very early in the morning, and so even with a lack of sleep, I came. So anyway,
Thank you.
it's not really much of a question. There are many points there that I wanted to react, like you two were in a sense discussing what poetry is in terms of it as a medium and whether it's on a page or has to be something said. And you were discussing about almost like there are only two kinds, like a poet of the page and a performance poet. But I think poetry can be both, but can be neither as well, because there are other ways of experiencing the poem. And I think, I don't know if you agree with me, and you might want to have more things to say about it. I think poetry is a different experience for each one, and so maybe you'd like to tell us how to clarify that, because for me it seems like it's limiting it into these two contexts, which is like I said, it's too limiting for me.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I like that. It's not just a poet on the page or a poet on the stage. No. There's also other kinds of poetry. I agree with that. There's maybe one useful way to think about it. It's an instinct. It's a poetic instinct. I think people are writing poems that don't look like poems. I think people are afraid of poetry because they had a terrible high school English teacher and the questions were very difficult. So they stopped writing poetry. I think a lot of poets think that poetry is only for those who are deep or distraught or crazy, So definitely those three things, those people write poetry. But I think what people don't realize is that sometimes we are doing poetry even if we're not writing poetry. I think it's an instinct. When you're watching a film on your laptop and there's a scene and you put it on pause because there's something in that image that catches your eye and it has nothing to do with the story, but it's just like the way that character has been paused and the color of her dress and the shape of her face. That's a poetic instinct. Poetry wants to keep things still. At least for me, it likes to freeze us things. In many ways, it's like photography. Maybe not all selfies are poems. I'm not trying to say that all selfies are poems. But there is something in the urge to capture a moment that would otherwise leave. That's the poetic instinct. And you would never say, you took 5 selfies today, you would never say, I wrote 5 poems today. But perhaps one of those 5 selfies might be a poem.
So you're saying that poetry is not necessarily words?
Yeah, I think there's something about the poetic instinct that transcends the genre. Certainly, poetry is found in the words.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily just words. Like you mentioned, it could be an experience, and something very specific about this experience makes you feel something more than it is. Yeah. I suppose. That's interesting. I've never, and I can relate because when when I was in school, then teachers will teach you about poetry, and then the first thing they say, okay, this is a poem, and then they give you, I don't really know, like this is the name of the poem. I mean, it's clear that I don't know and I didn't pay attention because I have no idea. But like, there's this many stops or this many lines, etc. And then if you, at least for me, if you tell me that that's what a poem is, And I'm just not interested in it automatically. As opposed to if you told me that there's poetry in anything, in a certain experience, that could have made me latch on to it more than I did. Interesting.
I like what you're saying, Carlo. Let me just highlight. You mentioned like a little thing felt like there was something more to it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that. That's really metaphor at work. That's really the poetic instinct. Kana bitang a seemingly little thing, and you just feel, there's something more to this.
Yeah, like you were mentioning, like the condensation and the spaghetti. I mean, right? it's such a small thing that people take for granted, but you somehow saw something there and you wanted to make something more out of it. Any more questions?
We have questions from Denver and Charles.
Maing buntag, Larry and Carlo. Question for Larry. So your chapbook is out today, available today for
Yes,
sale.
yeah.
So I wonder if you could tell us about it. Yeah, thank you.
It's called Night Report, and it's a small collection of poems that are, I would say, they're very personal lyrics. They extend some of the topics that were already explored in the Highest Hiding Place. I would like to think that they're a bit messier than the Highest Hiding Place. I think when I was writing my first book, I was obsessed with a kind of orderly cleanliness and sharp kind of writing. But the night report for me was an exploration of learning how to make the poem a bit more messy. That's one thing I think that I appreciated in the US, studying there, especially with first language speakers. They have a way of ripping up. No, kita man good, those of us who, we grow up here in the Philippines, we hold English in a very almost religiously. No? It has to be perfect. We're very judgmental with people who don't talk it perfectly. It's almost put on a pedestal. And I think it has lent itself to a kind of poetry that sometimes is a bit too clean. So it was very interesting to me to encounter in the US, American writers that were willing to tear up the language and rip it apart. And I was very shocked at how sacrilegious they were to the English language. But it also gave me an idea that maybe that's where interesting things can be done. Yeah, not all poems need to be like these perfect diamonds. It can be mess. Yeah.
You know what I found interesting? So he asked you about the book of poetry, the Night Report, and then you answered by talking about not the book. You talked about poetry in general.
Sorry, I didn't answer the question.
No, but it reminded me that about the being uncomfortable, about certain topics in poetry that are just uncomfortable to talk about in real life. And then it just hit me that that's probably why you push back a little bit, because you don't want to talk about the specific thing that's in there. I suspect.
Yes. No, I will admit. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard giving a summary to that book, So I hope you find something in there.
I guess the best way to find out is to read the book.
Read the book, yeah.
There
was another one.
More questions?
Any more questions?
Oh, there. Okay. I got you.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to ask Sir Larry, are there times when you go over older and already published poetry and tell yourself that maybe I could have done this better, or maybe if I had written this about the same thing now, the poem would have come out differently, or maybe in a better way?
Yeah. all the time. So I think a kind of perfectionism or obsession might be something a lot of poets have. I think poets particularly, we're obsessed with words, down to the word. You know, yeah, it's a very obsessive art form. Or it attracts obsessives, I think. So part of that obsession is really going back to poems that I wrote years ago and then realizing, bati man di ay ni? No? Maawaw naman taani. But then you live with it too, you know. I think that's part of the joy of publishing. It has a life of its own, ba? I mean, the opposite can also happen. There's a poem that you might have published and you were okay lang about it, and then 5 years down the road, you return to it and you're like, wow, I was great, you know. So it could also work the other way around. I think time has an interesting way of putting you as an artist differently. You will not write about the same subject matter in the same way. And that's where I think I go back to drop everything and do it, because at this particular moment in your life, this is how you will talk about, you know, love or loss or grief or joy at this point. And you're going to talk about it differently 5 years from now. And that's great too, that you change, you know. Yeah,
that got me thinking, Bob, because since, you know, we're human beings and it's our innate nature to look at the negative as opposed to the positive for whatever reason. And then, so like looking at like previous work, I wonder if that's like its own form of torture in a way, you know? Because you always feel like, because, well, you know, of course, as you mentioned, there's the other way of looking at it. Like you can look at it and say, oh, I did great. But I don't know, at least for me, it always feels like I could have done better in whatever it is, because I guess maybe it's a human thing or it might be a me thing, where it just you look at the negative more than the positive, I suppose.
I think that brings up the question of your mindset as you're working on an artwork, because you can bring in super self-critical, and that's good for the work. The fact that your discontent is good for the work. It's bad for your life, but it is good for the work, because without that discontent, the artwork will not sharpen. It will not get better. But also what I noticed, you also have to reach a point where you kind of accept that this is the best that you can do. And that's sometimes very hard to reach when you're an artist. It's called acceptance. It's saying, this is what I can do. This is the best that I can do. And then you let the work go. I think for anyone who's into the creative industry...
Oh, I think letting go is very important, because there are people who, let's say in music, they get stuck on one song, and then they just have that song over and over, and they keep trying to perfect it. But the trick is, I feel, is to go through as many bad songs as you can, and then eventually you'll hit like a good one. Let's say if you're creating music. That's, or like in photography, like I feel like the dirty little secret in photography is you take 1,000,000 photos and you're going to have 100 crappy photos, and then you're going to get one that's like, oh, this is the really good one. And then that's what you show people. I don't know.
Yeah, or that's where sometimes an editor or a co-worker becomes great. You know, when you're working on something and you're like, you have no idea which one works, and someone automatically comes into the room and says like, hey, that works. And you're like, oh, relieved, because you're like, someone else made the decision for you, and that's not necessarily bad either. Yeah.
Next question.
Yep. Larry, you have taught a lot of people in the past years, and I imagine that many of them were not like professional or full-time writers. Like, how do you help people who are, they're they have a 9 to 5 or they're businessmen, but they want to hone their craft? What are the best ways for them to do that?
For me, a lot of it takes a lot. One is exposure. I think when you want to develop your craft as a writer, it's important to read as widely as you can. a lot of teaching, I feel, is also about creating the space where people are allowed to be vulnerable. I think that's why we're drawn to the arts. It's because it's a space where we feel, even if for a moment it is fine to say or sing or paint what might not be good. And when you're teaching a group of artists who sometimes don't know they're artists, I get students who have no idea that they're super talented. They're just playing around. And then as a teacher, it is, for me, the best gift of a teacher is being able to see someone's talent even before she knows it. And to be able to say, hey, you might be a poet, is the greatest feeling. And it's also that recognition, it's creating that space. It's also making sure that students are allowed to bring the best and the worst of their lives into that space. I think sometimes there are people who have lived interesting lives, and there are people who have lived boring lives. And sometimes it's like, the lives aren't created equally. There are people who live lives that are meant to be written. So they come at an advantage because they have something to tell. But that's only the first part, because the second part is transforming what you've lived through into art. And that's what I think you're able to teach. Life will teach the student things. As a teacher, I think what you can do is really create the space and to bear witness to how they're trying to create that space. And let me just say this, I think what's super important is that you emphasize the fact of uniqueness. A lot of these people will come to you thinking that there's a certain set of rules that they have to follow, and after they follow all those rules, they will turn into a writer. When in fact, one of the more difficult things to do is really to figure out what in you makes you unique. And in many ways, that's part of the challenge of teaching writing. It's not just words. Words are just the excuse. I think it's really letting a student realize which parts of my life would be interesting to reshape. Yeah.
Oh.
So,
Can I? I've been teaching for a while. Hi, Larry. And I've been teaching for a while, and I find that one of the hardest and most difficult lessons for me to teach young people is the idea of gaze. I teach painting, so I wonder if this works as well in poetry. And it's not just, you see, as far as I'm concerned, I begin to realize that the student begins really to understand art as soon as he or she realizes this, that the painting is also addressing and in fact constructing a third person, Lar. It's the fact of the gaze that the painter is not assuming that the painting is his statement. The painting is also creating a fictitious third person who is looking at the painting but is in a sense invisible.
yes.
And I wonder if this works also. Is this also in poetry what is called voice? That even as we read your poetry, we imagine a person actually speaking to us. And this person is not exactly you. It might be you, but it is a fictitious person that you are constructing with your words. It's kind of complicated that way, and that's why it's a difficult lesson to teach.
Yeah, thanks, Rames. It's bringing up for me the question of it's a question of how do you look? Where do you look? I can imagine when you're teaching painting, you're teaching craft, you're teaching the hand, but you're also teaching the eye. And there are some artists who are very good with the hand, but they just don't know where to look. And then there are those who know exactly where to look, pero kuwang lang, you're teaching them with the hand. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going back to the image again of the spaghetti. It's been a spaghetti interview, Carlo. But you know, when you want to write a beach, what is in an artist that will make the artist choose to draw the sweat in the Tupperware from the spaghetti? Instead of the sand, instead of the waves, instead of the sun. I mean, the sun and the sand, and they're all there too. But the poem is not there. The poem is in the sweat of the Tupperware, of the spaghetti. And who knows what that means? But you, as an artist, you get the sense that your experience of the beach is in that very weird little thing. And I think part of teaching is helping students learn to know where to look. Because students will look at the obvious places. But teach them where to look, where it might hurt or tickle is where I think the interesting things happen.
Thank you.
And anybody else?
Any more questions? Yes, guys?
Maybe questions for Carlo too. I've been checking out your podcast, for this interview. So I've been doing research too, okay. Carlo. You're not the only one doing that. And I think it's great what 032 is doing in terms of just documenting creativity in Cebu. I have no idea what that's going to look like 3-4 years from now, but I feel like by documenting just different artists from different fields must be amazing and uncomfortable and exciting to you too,
Yeah, it's as much as I don't like talking about myself. It's the thing that I realized is I enjoy having one-on-one conversations with interesting people. And by the nature of talking to creatives or creative people, and then I put creativity in this big bucket. It can be art, it can be design, it can even be entrepreneurship because there's a lot of creativity there. But talking to interesting people is fun. And so that's why I continue to do this, the 032 Conversations podcast. And then as a byproduct of it, I realized that maybe a few months ago that it's a good way for people's stories to be recorded in history and not lost. Because one of growing up here, I didn't know, if I wanted to know about the early 80s or early 90s, about the culture in Cebu, the way for me to do it would be to talk to an artist or talk to somebody in that field. And then, you have to get them in person. You have to talk to them. And no one was really, at least as far as I know, I could be wrong, but I couldn't find anything that was recording our culture in that aspect. So the podcast has allowed at least people in my generation to, share their stories, and at least it'll be there, forever, as long as I continue to pay the monthly fee.
Yeah.
I
think it's bringing, just to maybe before our interview ends, how important it is to listen and maybe meet older artists, older than us, and you get the sense that there are people other than you who create. I'm really reminded about that because, she's in the audience and she's giving a talk later, but Merly Alunan was the first living, because we like to think poets are dead, diba? So she was the first living poet that I met. And I remember her tearing up someone's poem apart. And I was like, wow, this is how you learn poetry, no? Through shame and grit and love, And it was important to me to, I think, see her, because you understand that, creating and writing is a living process, and there are people behind those artworks. And, and there are, voices behind it. And for me, that's one of the strongest things about the podcast that I've noticed is it's allowing people to have access to those thoughts.
Well, yeah, that actually, I try to think of my listener as somebody who's young and who hasn't started and who wants to start but doesn't know where to go and who doesn't know what to do, and then who doesn't know who to look up to. So that's one way. I mean, if you can't meet them in real life, fortunately you were able to do that. But if you can't meet them in real life, hopefully you can search it on Google and then their name pops up, and then you can listen to somebody who's actually going through the same thing in the same place you are from.
I think we might.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah. If you're, I'll be signing books right after this interview. So I think there will be a table somewhere there. If you're interested in getting a copy of Night Report, it's only being released today, and there's a super limited amount of that book. So I hope you check it out, and I'll be there. I'll be glad to talk to you and
All right.
chat.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that conversation.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of 032 Conversations. Larry's insight into the whole creative process was really, really cool. It was a really good experience to do it live. I'm not sure we'll do it again. I mean, maybe, but doing it live just changes the whole dynamic. Maybe in the future I'll schedule a private interview with Larry, but for now, this is what we will give you. The nice thing with interviewing Larry too is that he gave a totally different perspective from what I was used to. For example, one of the questions in the Q&A portion was like, what's your advice to writing if you have like a 9 to 5 or something? And then my initial instinct was to just, in my head, I didn't say it, it wasn't addressed to me, but in my head was just do it. Just, stop watching Game of Thrones. That's what I was thinking in my head, or stop watching Netflix or whatever. And he came at it from a totally different perspective. He came at it from look for a way to find your voice, that type of thing. So it was really good to get his perspective. If you enjoyed the interview, please leave a rating on iTunes. It helps us get more listeners and allows us to make better shows. The music from this podcast is Piano March by Audionautics. Before I interviewed Larry, he sent me a few audio recordings of his poetry or essays. I thought a good way to end the interview would be Larry reading one of his essays called Radio Days. Yeah, so thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Here's Radio Days by Larry Ypil. Thank you, everybody.
Radio Days. These days, radio is not as simple as it used to be. Especially now when it's listened to in a car at dusk in the middle of Cebu traffic, or from your laptop through the net in stream saved from 3 months past of a radio show from the middle of the other side of the world. Simpler, really, the way it used to be. In a summer afternoon, with the neighbor's petulant dog yapping safely behind a wire fence, and 4 or 5 bikes leaning snugly against the stone wall under the vines, and a burgeoning storm traveling slowly across the Banilad skyline. You and your friends lie on a huge bed, listless and lazy, waiting for the song you had just requested over the phone to be played. All thanks, of course, to the fact that one of you personally knew the DJ who was in charge of the hour, knew his voice, that is, and loved it, spawning long daydreams of a forever unfulfilled correlation between voice and face. And he knew yours, or at least most of the time, mostly because you had spent every single day for the past week calling the station at the same hour, requesting the same DJ for the same song. Of such redundancies were adolescent radio wave obsessions made of. and of such blind, faithful determinations. For music then was more than music. It was the gauge for coolness. You were who you listened to, or refused to listen to. Friendships were tested on the basis of pop idols. Fights were settled by way of top 40 countdowns. It was the barometer of taste and a yet-to-be-discovered self. Oh, tumultuous puberty of decisions, whether rocker or balladeer, diva or girl group, slowly growing popular and eventually embarrassing boy band. And because you couldn't decide, you wanted everything. It was the soul of the city. For although music, radio music, certainly gave the sense of coming from elsewhere, all of you knew perfectly well that it came from the station on the hill, really just a 5-minute drive away. Upon the ear was shaped the geography of your home. Although we can now easily carry these rhythm homes with us through the phone, and we can certainly determine when, where, how many times on the loop we can listen to what we have finally chosen to listen to, I can't help but miss sometimes the random serendipities of radio. Just the other night, I listened to a downloaded episode of Studio 360, a radio show broadcasted on NPR, featuring an hour-long discussion of Jack Kerouac's 60s classic On the Road. And I couldn't help but suddenly remember a dear friend who recently passed away who would have loved to listen to this. To those long ruminations of traveling to places we never get to. To the cello piece inspired by the book. To the discussion of a group of friends on why and how they love to read. A discussion she and I would have exactly made if she were still alive. And although the powers of choice and deliberation allowed me to listen to that podcast on that particular night, particular hour, who would have known this would have led me to a sudden memory of a lost friendship? Deep surprise of the deep tears of the loss of someone who made us laugh out of nowhere. As deep as that night of long ago radio when in the dark room, ready for sleep, we stayed awake, waiting, believing that someone out there had decided it was time, finally time, to play our song.